Well, good morning, everybody, and a very happy Father's Day to all the dads. Fathers are absolutely essential, unbelievably important, absolutely essential. Don't let anybody ever tell you any different. It seems like for years and years, in a lot of research that was being done and TV shows that were going on, the dad was the bumbling fool who has no idea what's going on, who doesn't know anything, and don't go ask him for advice, right? We all saw a lot of that. It seems like in recent years, a lot of that's been changing. I think the value of fathers is being seen a little bit. And what's fascinating is there are actually studies that have been done about children who don't even have fathers in the house. If there are good dads in the neighborhood, those children who don't even have fathers in their household have better outcomes than children who don't have a father in the house and don't have good dads in the neighborhood. So I think that the effects of good fathers can really be overlooked. There's a lot of things that can just pass right over our eyes and we won't even see those things. And this morning, what I want to do is I want to look at an example of a father that I know that I have overlooked, that I haven't really given a lot of thought to. And that's Joseph, the earthly adopted father of Jesus. And so, what I'd like to do this morning is sort of go to almost all of the passages that we have about Joseph and then paint a portrait of what we can know about Joseph, a portrait of a father, if you will. And so, if you will, turn to Matthew chapter 1, please. Matthew chapter 1. And the way that I want to do this morning is try as much as we can to go in chronological order, in the order that the events occurred. And so you can see this line up on the screen. I'm going to provide a very, very crude timeline, and hopefully that'll keep us organized. And I think almost all of the passages that we're going to turn to are going to be on the screen. So we're mainly going to be in the very beginning of Matthew's gospel and the very beginning of Luke's gospel. And just so we can see a portrait of Joseph, the earthly adopted father of Jesus. So if you're in Matthew chapter 1, look down with me, please, at verse 18. Verse 18. I'd like to say a lot about the genealogy, but for time's sake, we'll jump over a little bit of that. Matthew chapter 1, and let's look at verse 18, please. Let's start there. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Verse 19, and Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, planned to send her away secretly. But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. And Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took Mary as his wife, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. So here in these verses, we see Mary is betrothed to Joseph. But look at verse 19. Verse 19, Joseph is already called her husband. This is fascinating stuff because in the Jewish law, or the way that Jewish people did this, betrothal was a whole lot more than just being engaged the way that we might have it today. The husband was already considered the husband, but the woman was still in the household of her father. So fascinating stuff. Joseph is already called her husband, and it was more like a binding contract. It was like a contract that couldn't be done away with unless somebody died or divorced. It was considered divorce before they fully consummated the marriage. And it took about a year before the public ceremony and they would consummate the marriage. But here in verse 18, before they came together, Mary is found to be with child. And we know that it's by the power of the Holy Spirit, but Joseph doesn't know that when we get to verse 19. Because verse 19, look what it says about him. He's a righteous man, and he doesn't want to disgrace her. He doesn't want to make her a public spectacle or embarrass her or make her seem less worthy than I guess he views her to be. He plans to divorce her in secret. Now, if this was just a normal case of somebody getting pregnant before getting married, I got to stop because that was just so cute. I'm so sorry. Manuel just came over there and hugged David. That was amazing. Anyway, let me get back to what I'm talking about. If somebody was found to be pregnant before they came together and consummated the marriage, the repercussions of that under the law, number one, Joseph would have every right to rightfully divorce her in Deuteronomy 24. But the actual penalty that's laid out in Deuteronomy 22 is stoning. So Joseph would have been well within his rights, first of all, just to divorce her and let everybody know, because then the punishment could have been stoning. But we know that Joseph is a righteous man. He's a law abiding man, and he seems like a very merciful man as well, because he chooses not to make a public spectacle of her, but to divorce her privately and not make her a public spectacle. That seems to me to be a pretty hard choice before we even go any further. I don't know about you, but if I'm engaged to somebody and then they get pregnant and you know it's not with you, I'd probably be telling everybody about what happened and let them know this is why I'm not getting with this person, right? Well, Joseph doesn't do that. He was a very merciful man and very secretly wanted to put her away. But when he thought about this in a dream, an angel, a messenger of the Lord, comes to him in a dream and says, "Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. She hasn't been unfaithful to you. Actually, on the contrary, she's such a faithful woman that of all women, God chose her to bear the Son of God." And the angel, or Matthew here, reminds us that this was taking place because of what was said in Isaiah chapter 7, that a virgin would conceive and bear the Son of God. And so verse 24, Joseph wakes up after receiving this message in a dream from God, and he obeyed. He did what God commanded. He took Mary as his wife, but verse 25, Joseph kept Mary a virgin until after Jesus was born. Now, we don't have any details about exactly what this was like for Joseph, but that had to be a difficult thing for him to be a fully married man and have the right to consummate your marriage. However, to have the restraint as a man of God to wait. I mean, that shows us something about Joseph. He's this Isaiah 7 prophecy that Matthew reveals to us here is that a virgin will bear the Son of God. And so Joseph was willing to obey God, even if it was difficult for him, even if it would involve sacrifice from him. That's the kind of man that Joseph was. And one of the details at the end of verse 25, he called his name Jesus. Joseph called Jesus Jesus. And by doing that, the genealogy that's given in Matthew chapter 1, the royal lineage of David through Solomon was passed on to Jesus. That was through Joseph, not through Mary. The biological line through Mary was not the royal line through Solomon, but that was through Joseph. So Joseph adopts Jesus as his earthly father. And it's really an amazing thing. Joseph obeys God. He's a righteous, merciful man, and he obeys God even when it was difficult for him, even when it was difficult. And it's just a really important thing that we need to see. What's also interesting for us to notice here that I want to bring out is just that it seems like rumors about how Jesus was conceived were spreading around the area. Because all the way in John chapter 8, when Jews are talking to Jesus, one of the things that they say and give him a little jab is, well, we weren't born of fornication. And they were sort of insinuating that Jesus had been. So there was some disgrace, some public shame, some rumors being spread about how Jesus was conceived. Now, those accusations were false. But Joseph had to bear those rumors from other people. Jesus had to bear those rumors from other people throughout their lifetimes. And so Joseph was willing to obey God, even if it came at personal cost to him and his reputation. Fascinating stuff. Let's continue our timeline, though. Turn over to Luke chapter 2, please. Luke chapter 2. And as we turn over to Luke chapter 2, Mary is nearing the end of her pregnancy here. Luke chapter 2. And let's look at the first 7 verses together, please. Luke chapter 2. Mary is nearing the end of her pregnancy. Luke chapter 2. And let's start with the first 7 verses. Now, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Luke 2, verse 4. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. While they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. And she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the upper room. So we see in these verses that there's a decree from Caesar Augustus that says, we're taking a census, and we see that Joseph takes Mary and they go from Nazareth to Judea to Bethlehem because he is of the house of David. And Mary is still pregnant with Jesus at this time. And Joseph is compliant with all the governing authorities. He goes to Bethlehem. and makes this really long trek from Nazareth to Bethlehem with his pregnant wife. More on that in a second. They get to Bethlehem. They're likely staying with their relatives. There's no room for them in the upper room guest quarters, so they likely stay in the lower level where some of the animals would have been kept. And what I want us to notice is Joseph is here through all of this. Through all of these things that are going on, Joseph is present. He is there. And if you've done any travel with a pregnant woman, then you know just around the corner can be a rough little trek, right? There's a bump in the road and you're going to hear about it. And we've got all kinds of luxuries today that they didn't have then. Joseph was right there taking care of Mary, going to Bethlehem. And then Joseph is there when Jesus is born. And let's look at some more of that. Let's go down to verse 15, please. Let's see some more of this. Verse 15, Luke 2, verse 15. When the angels had gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds began saying to one another, "Let us go straight to Bethlehem then and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us." So the shepherds came in a hurry and found their way to Mary and Joseph and the baby as he lay in the manger. When they had seen this, they made known the statement which had been told about this child. And all who heard it wondered at the things which were told them by the shepherds. But Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. The shepherds went back, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, just as had been told them. So we see the shepherds on the night that Jesus is born. They come to the house where Jesus is lying in the manger, and just notice who's there. Joseph's there. Joseph and Mary are both there. Joseph is present. He is there for all of these things. And I want us to notice this. The shepherds began to recount all the things that they heard, and they saw the heavenly host and all that they said about this child. And notice verse 18. All who heard it wondered. We know Joseph was there. So Joseph is one of these people who hear these wonderful things that the shepherds had seen and heard about Jesus, and he's amazed by Jesus. He's amazed by all these things that they're saying about this. So focusing on Joseph here, he's present. He heard the news about this miraculous child, and Joseph is amazed by Jesus. Well, let's keep reading. About 7 to 8 days later, look at verse 21. 7 to 8 days later, verse 21. And when 8 days had passed, before his circumcision, his name was then called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days for their purification, according to the law of Moses, were completed, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written in the law of the Lord. Every firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what was said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So we see here Jesus being circumcised on the 8th day. He's 8 days old, and they officially name him Jesus, just as they were told to name him. And then, because Mary gives birth to a son, she had a purification ritual that she had to attend to. This would have been 33 days of purification, 33 days according to the law of Moses, and then they would present the firstborn to the priest. So Jesus is now 1 month old. After the 33 days, Jesus is 1 month old, I think we would say here. And they're supposed to bring a 1-year-old lamb or and a pigeon or a turtle dove so that Mary would be ceremonially clean, excuse me. But then we get a detail about Joseph and Mary that they were not well off financially. Because if we look at verse 24, they followed the law, but they brought 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And what's fascinating about that is that was the accommodation for the people that couldn't afford the lamb and the pigeon and the turtle dove. So this tells us Joseph and Mary were not financially wealthy at all, but God still chose to use Joseph to be the earthly adopted father of Jesus. I think that's fascinating. They're not financially wealthy, but that doesn't mean that God couldn't use them for his purposes. And we also see that it's important to Joseph to follow the law of the Lord. You know, they follow the purification rituals. They're going to bring Jesus to the priest. They're going to do all the things that the law laid out here. But let's look at some more of this. Look down at verse 27, please. Go down to verse 27. And before we actually read verse 27, while Joseph and Mary are bringing Jesus into the temple so that they can fulfill what the law says for them to do, there's an old man named Simeon. And Simeon was told by God, you won't die until you see the Christ. So let's look at verse 27 because Simeon sees some things here. Look at verse 27. He came in the spirit, Simeon came in the spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to carry out for him the custom of the law, then he took him into his arms and blessed God and said, "Now, Lord, you are releasing your bondservant to depart in peace according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the presence of all peoples, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel." Look at verse 33. And his father and mother were amazed at the things which were being said about him. And I love this because Mary and Joseph, they come into the temple, they're following the law of the Lord. And here comes Simeon in the spirit, takes the baby Jesus into his arms, and he says these just miraculous, wonderful things here. And he says, "This is the Lord's salvation. This is a light to the Gentiles. This is the glory of Israel right here." And the result in verse 33 is that Joseph and Mary are amazed. They are just astonished at what they're saying about Jesus, their child. And Joseph is right there, and he is amazed by Jesus. And even the next section that we're not going to read this morning, but there's a woman named Anna who's a prophetess, and she has things that she says about Jesus. And his parents are just amazed at all the things that are being said about Jesus. Joseph is right there. He hears these things, and Joseph is just as amazed at Jesus as anybody else is. Okay, let's look down at verse 39, please. Chapter 2, look down at verse 39, please. When they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. The child continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. I think it's really important that we notice in verse 39, they performed everything according to the law. You know, Joseph and Mary, it was important to them to follow the law of the Lord. It's very easy to do things halfway, right? Or a quarter of the way. Joseph and Mary were intent on following the law, and Joseph was leading his family in that. But then we see they go back to Galilee, they go back to Nazareth, and verse 40 just gives us this statement about Jesus grows up, he gets strong, he grows in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. The next time that we're going to come back to Luke 2, we're going to see that Jesus is 12 years old. And something that I overlook as I'm doing my Bible reading sometime is, you know, Joseph was right there during that 12 years. Joseph was right there raising Jesus in whatever role that fathers had in the first century for Jewish fathers. Joseph was right there doing that. And we're going to come back to this when Jesus is 12 because there's some more that we can see about Jesus and more that we can see about Joseph in between. And so around up to 2 years after Jesus is born, let's go back to Matthew chapter 2, please. Matthew chapter 2. And we'll get to our next little timeline marker here. Matthew chapter 2, please. So the last thing we just read, Jesus was 1 month old in the temple, and then it says he starts growing in wisdom and stature and in the grace of God. And then in Luke's account, we're going to see him when he turns 12 or when he is 12. So let's go to Matthew chapter 2, and this is around 2 years after Jesus is born, and we see the Magi, those wise men from the east, come to visit Jesus. But I think we see more about Joseph after those Magi or those wise men leave. So in Matthew chapter 2, look at verse 13 with me, please. Verse 13. Now, when they, the Magi, had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." So Joseph got up, and he took the child and his mother while it was still night, and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I called my son." So an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream. We've seen that before, haven't we? But an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream, and he says, "Get up, take Mary, take the child, go to Egypt, because Herod is trying to kill the baby Jesus," or the toddler Jesus at this time. Herod is trying to kill him. And so notice what we don't see. We don't see Joseph wake up and have any rebuttals. We don't see any arguments. We don't see anything about, well, we're pretty comfortable here, we don't want to go to Egypt. We see in verse 14, Joseph got up, he took the child and his mother while it was still night. He gets his family and he takes them down to Egypt. He obeys the Lord that very night. Joseph did that. He led his family to go down to Egypt. And in verse 15, Matthew gives us something from the prophet Hosea about how Jesus is the true Israel and sort of represents Israel there. But focusing on Joseph again, God sends another messenger with an instruction to him. Joseph doesn't argue. He doesn't make any excuses. He obeys the Lord and takes his family down to Egypt. When God reveals things to him, Joseph leads his family in the ways of the Lord. Look down at verse 19 with me, please, because we're going to see even more about Joseph in a very similar fashion. Look down at verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." So Joseph got up. He took the child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. Verse 22. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. And so here in these verses, Herod dies, and it seems like it's the same angel that warned Joseph to take his family to Egypt, comes to Joseph in a dream and says, okay, they're dead. Go back to Israel. And again, we don't see any arguments. We don't see any rebuttals. We don't see, well, we've been living in Egypt for a couple of years now, and we really like it here, so we're really comfortable. No, he gets up, he leads his family back to Israel. He obeys what God told him to do. But something that's really fascinating to me is here in verse 22. In verse 22, Joseph hears that Archelaus is reigning in Judea. Archelaus was Herod's son, and he was cruel, he was tyrannical, and he was sensual. But I want us to notice Joseph hears that Archelaus is in Judea, and Joseph is already worried about it. He's already looking for the well-being of his family. He's already thinking about how to best protect his family. And then after that in verse 22, then God warns him in a dream, and he goes to Galilee. So what I want us to see is Joseph was already thinking about the well-being of his family. He was already trying to protect his family. And then when God reveals a warning to him, hey, that's an easy decision. They go to Galilee and they settle in Nazareth. And so Joseph already actively seeking the well-being of his family. And then when God speaks, Joseph listens. An amazing example for us today. And so they settle in Nazareth, and Matthew tells us that this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. This humble podunk town that was rejected is the nature that the Messiah would come as well. And so it was about 6 AD when Archelaus was deposed from his reign. So Jesus was a toddler when they went down to Egypt. We don't know how long exactly that they were in Egypt, but likely under 12. For sure, I would say under 12. Jesus is a toddler at this time. So now let's go back to Luke chapter 2, please. Luke chapter 2, and we're going to jump forward in the timeline to when Jesus is 12 years old. Luke chapter 2, please. Luke chapter 2. And here in Luke chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 41. Luke 2, verse 41. This is where we left off from Luke's gospel just a few minutes ago. Luke chapter 2, let's look down at verse 41, please. Now, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when Jesus became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. And as they were returning after spending the full number of days, the boy, Jesus, stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents were unaware of it, but supposed him to be in the caravan and went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When they saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us this way?" Look at the middle of verse 48. "Behold, your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." And he said to them, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my father's house or about my father's business?" But they did not understand the statement which he made to them. And when he went down with them and came to Nazareth, he continued in subjection to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with man. So here in this section, we get some details here at the very beginning that Joseph and Mary every year went up to the temple for the feast of the Passover. That's what they were supposed to do according to the law, but we know that there were plenty of people who didn't actually do that. But I do think that we see something about Joseph, that he is leading his family in the law of the Lord. It was important for his family to follow the law. And we also see in, in verse 43, They spent the full number of days for the feast. They didn't just halfway follow the law. They didn't just a little bit. They were intent on fully following the law of God. And they brought their child with them up there too. So Jesus is 12 at this point. They spend the full number of days and they leave. And it says they go about a day's journey away in verse 44. And then they notice that Jesus isn't with them. I got more to say about that in just a second. So they notice that Jesus isn't with them. He's not with their group. So they go back the day's journey away. And then it says in verse 46, they search for him for 3 days. For 3 days. Now, I don't know exactly how this worked. I don't know if it was 3 days total of searching or if it was 1 day's journey, another day's journey back, and then once they got there, 3 days of searching. Whichever one it is, 3 to 5 days, they didn't know where their 12-year-old son is. And then on top of that, they know that this is the Son of God. Could you imagine you lost him? I mean, that would be horrible, right? I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like. And my kids aren't the Son of God like Jesus is for sure. This would be terrifying. And so when they find him, he's in the temple. And he's amazing anybody and everybody that can hear him and see what he's doing. And Mary, they find him, and Mary says, "Why have you treated us this way?" And I love the middle of verse 48, because Mary says, "Your father and I were anxiously searching for you." Joseph was right there with Mary, anxiously searching for their child. They've been raising him for 12 years. They know he's not an ordinary child. They were worried about him. This shows us that Joseph, just like Mary, deeply cares about Jesus. It's not like Joseph was an apathetic, where's the kid? Joseph was anxiously searching for Jesus too. But then Jesus sort of corrects Mary and he says, "Why? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house or about my father's business?" And he's not talking about Joseph there. He's talking about God the Father. And we don't know how Joseph took that, but we do know from verse 50, they didn't understand exactly what he meant by that. Now, again, we don't know how Joseph would have taken this, but Joseph was Jesus's earthly adopted father. And he was right there raising him, searching anxiously for all of this. And what's amazing to me is verse 51, Jesus, the Son of God, continued in subjection to them. Joseph and Mary still played a big part in being the earthly parents of Jesus. And Jesus chose to be in subjection to them. It's an amazing thing to me. And something that I forget about so much is that Joseph played the role of the earthly father of Jesus. He raised him. And really an amazing thing. And so verse 52, Jesus increased in wisdom, in stature, in favor with God and man. Jesus grows up. Now, on a really sad note for our timeline, this is the last time that we see Joseph. This is the last time that we really see him present for anything. And the general consensus is that Joseph passed away and that he wasn't around for Jesus's public ministry. Jesus's public ministry starts when he's about 30. So some time has really gone by the next time that we see Jesus do his public ministry. We do know that Joseph raised Jesus at the very least to the age of 12. We do know that. But just because Joseph wasn't around for Jesus's public ministry, that doesn't mean that Joseph didn't have an effect on Jesus during that public ministry. So let's go to Matthew 13, please. Matthew 13, please. I don't have this one on the slide, but Matthew chapter 13, we see something about Joseph that affects Jesus throughout his life. Matthew chapter 13, please. And while you're turning to Matthew 13, there's a very similar account of this in Luke chapter 4, but I want to look at this one. Jesus comes back to Nazareth. He comes to his hometown. He is teaching. He's performing miracles, doing amazing things. The people are amazed, but then they have some questions to ask about Jesus. And in Matthew 13, look at verse 55. This is what they're asking. Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, and his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household. And so here in these verses, they're asking, isn't this the carpenter's son? And so we see something about Joseph's occupation. He was a carpenter. He worked hard with his hands. But it also seems that it wasn't a very high socially ranking job. They're like, this is just the carpenter's son. Who's this guy think he is? We know Mary. We know Joseph's other kids. I mean, like, who does this guy think he is? And so they took offense at him, and Jesus condemns them for their unbelief. But Joseph was a carpenter. Mary had to eat. Jesus had to eat. All those other kids, they had to eat. They had multiple kids. They had to eat. And so Joseph worked hard with his hands to provide for his family. And what's also fascinating to me is that it's not just that people would ask, isn't this the carpenter's son? In Mark's account, in Mark chapter 6, in a very similar scenario, they were asking, isn't this the carpenter? They didn't say, isn't this the carpenter's son? They said, isn't this the carpenter? Talking about Jesus. So although Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus, Jesus still, in some capacity, followed in the footsteps of his earthly father's career, at least for a while before his public ministry. And that's just amazing to me. It's stuff that I don't usually think about. So Joseph may not have been Jesus's biological father, but Jesus takes after him in several ways that maybe we don't even get to read about, but especially about carpentry. Okay, so as far as I know, the ones that we've gone to today are almost all of the passages that we have about Joseph, Jesus's earthly adopted father. And I hope that this helps you appreciate Joseph a little more. He's a good man, and I for sure appreciate him a lot more for what he experienced, what he saw, and what he did in this whole plan. What I want to do now is just make a few observations about Joseph, of all the observations we can make, and then apply them to us today. The first one I hope is obvious is that Joseph obeyed God. Joseph obeyed God. And specifically, Joseph obeyed God even when it was difficult for him, or even if it brought some kind of shame on him. One of the first things we read about Joseph was that he was a righteous man, and he demonstrated that. He wanted to secretly put Mary away. When God sends a messenger and says, don't be afraid to marry Mary, he marries her. And then he waits to consummate the marriage until after Jesus is born. That would have been a hard thing for a man to have the right by marriage and then, as a man of God, to wait, to have that restraint. And then when God tells Joseph, go to Egypt to protect Jesus, he gets up that very night, takes him down there. When an angel says, hey, go back into Israel, they go back. When he warns them about Archelaus, they go up to Nazareth. Joseph obeyed God over and over and over again. And we see no rebuttals. We see no arguments, no negotiating or anything like that. Joseph obeyed God. And so this morning, for fathers, for wives, for kids here, for everybody in the congregation, we need to be like Joseph and obey the Lord, even if it's difficult for us or even if it brings on some shame for us. Joseph had to bear the rumors that were going on about how Mary conceived, and Jesus had to bear that as well. And Joseph still obeyed the Lord. When God speaks, we listen. And we have to know what God says for us to listen. We've got to get into the word. May we all have this kind of faith that Joseph had, to obey God no matter what. The next one that I want to make about Joseph here is that he led his family. Joseph led his family, and he led his family in the ways of the Lord, first and foremost. But then Joseph also led his family just in the everyday things of life. And I think we see a lot of those things. In the ways of the Lord, Joseph made sure that his family followed the law in the purification rituals, in giving the firstborn to the priest and devoting him to God. In Luke chapter 2, he says they went up to the appointed feast every year and they stayed for the full number of days. They fully followed the law, and it was so important for them. And Joseph led his family in the ways of the Lord. But Joseph also led his family just in the everyday, mundane things of life. Joseph travels with and takes care of his pregnant wife on the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Joseph did that. Joseph is there when Jesus is born. He's there when all these people are saying these amazing things about Jesus. He hears all of these things. Joseph was aware of Archelaus and the threat that he posed. He was actively seeking to protect his family. And then when they lost Jesus, Joseph is right there anxiously looking for his kid right alongside Mary. Joseph was present, Joseph was a protector, and he worked hard as a carpenter to provide for his family. Wow. I mean, what an example for us, right? And we know they weren't financially wealthy, but Joseph had his priorities straight. He led his family in the ways of the Lord first and foremost. And if you're leading your family in the ways of the Lord, you're right there in the everyday things of life. And so for fathers here this morning, we need to lead our families in the Lord. We need to lead our families in the Lord and in the everyday things of life. For wives here this morning, let your husband lead. And if they're not, encourage them to lead in the ways of the Lord. For kids, if you've got a father who's leading you and leading you in the ways of the Lord, that is a tremendous blessing. Even if you don't like it now, that's a tremendous blessing, and praise God for your father. And if they're not, encourage them to lead in the ways of the Lord. And then just for our entire congregation here, we want more elders, right? We want more deacons here, don't we? What's one of the characteristics of elders and deacons? Leaders at home. So if we want more of those, we've got to have leaders in the home. Fathers, we need to lead in the ways of the Lord. We need to lead in the everyday, mundane things of life. And Joseph is a great example for us. Now, the last one that I want to notice this morning, and this is probably my favorite of all of these, is that Joseph was amazed by Jesus, the earthly adopted father of Jesus, who saw him born, raised him, saw him grow up as long as he lived, was amazed by Jesus. Joseph was not the main character. And it seems like Joseph knew that, and he was happy to fulfill the role that God had given to him. What an amazing example for us. When angels spoke to him, when other people said what God revealed to them, and when Jesus, at 12 years old, speaks about his role, Joseph is amazed by Jesus, even if he doesn't understand exactly what's going on. Joseph is amazed by Jesus. He knew who he is, he cared about Jesus deeply, and he played the role that God gave to him. For us today, main character syndrome is a real thing. Have you heard of that? Main character syndrome? That's where we think that we're the main character and everybody else kind of has to do whatever we want, or we think everything revolves around us and we're the main character in our story. Well, Joseph didn't think like that. Joseph was amazed by Jesus and he played his role in supporting him. And so Jesus should be the main character in all of our stories as well. And we should just try to play the role of supporting him. That's all we should be doing. For fathers this morning, as we obey the Lord, as we teach our families, we lead our families, as we continue to learn, we don't do it because I'm a man and it's about me. We do it because it's all about Jesus and we want to glorify him. For wives, play your role. Let your husband lead, but check him when he needs it. Don't check him because you want to be right, but do it because you want what Jesus wants. You want what Jesus says is right and to glorify and honor him. For kids, submit to your parents. Submit to your parents and honor them and give all glory to Jesus. It's not about you. It's all about Jesus. But for all of us, for everybody in the room, if I didn't address you in the groups I've said, the more that we are amazed by Jesus and not by ourselves, we will play the role that God has given us to play. We are not the main character. Jesus is, and he is amazing. May we all be amazed by Jesus. And so as we close this morning, I think Joseph is a wonderful example for everybody in the room. And he is such an overlooked father that I know that I have overlooked. And I hope that this helps you to appreciate him more. But also, I hope that looking at Joseph helps you appreciate Jesus more, because Joseph was amazed by Jesus. And so as we close, if you want to study the scriptures about the amazing Jesus, we would love to study with you. There's nothing we would love more than to do that with you. We would love to do that. Or if you know that Jesus is the Son of God, you know that you need to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins and join his family. We've got water and we would love to do that this morning. We would love to do that. Or if you've become a Christian before, but maybe your priorities have gone askew and you're not amazed by Jesus as you have been before, and you want to make it right. Whatever you need, whatever your spiritual need, let it be known while we stand and while we sing this morning.